Good morning to this webinar on the state of the private rental sector. I'm Martina Lees from the Sunday Times, and I will be your chair for this session. So today we are in the middle of one of the biggest changes in the rented sector in a generation. With the Renters' Rights Bill, it will be the end of Section 21 no-fault evictions. When it came in 1988, that paved the way for the buy-to-let boom. And now that the big question is how things will change. So the TDS Charitable Foundation has done some research surveying tenants and landlords to paint a picture of the state of the market and the sector as it is now. And that will shed some light. So today's webinar is about what that research says. And we have some brilliant speakers to discuss that. So just to point out that there is a briefing note in the chat function on the research that you can have a look at. And then I would like to introduce our speakers. So I hope that they are all here. So with us today is Dr. Jennifer Harris, who is the Head of Policy, Research and Strategy at TDS. She has been behind this report, and she will talk us through what it says. And then we have Darren Baxter, who leads the work on housing and land at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So Darren has before did a PhD on how Section 21 no-fault eviction notices impact individuals' ability to derive a sense of emotional security from their work. And he has held various research positions at other think tanks. And then we also have Samuel Hughes, who is the head of housing at the Centre of Policy Studies think tank and a research fellow at the University of Oxford. He has also been a policy fellow at the Housing Ministry under the previous government recently. So great insights there. And I am going to start off by introducing Jennifer to give us an overview of what the research says. Jennifer, are you here?
Hello, thank you very much, Martina, and welcome everybody to this webinar. Thank you for joining us. So I manage the TDS Charitable Foundation, which is an organisation that aims to improve standards in the private rental sector, partly through conducting research. So today I'm going to pull out just a few of the main key findings from two national surveys that we've been carried out to better explore the experience of working and living in the private rented sector. They're continuous surveys, which means we'll be conducting them on a regular basis with a different sample of landlords and tenants, which will allow us to explore how things are changing over time as we sort of go through this significant period of change, as Martina described. To date, we've done 4 waves with over 8,000 renters and 1 wave with 2,000 landlords. The research is representative of landlords and tenants living and working within the sector, and the findings that I'll discuss today are statistically representative. So that means we can be fairly sure it does kind of reflect the experience of living and working in the sector. In terms of the topics we look at, there's been a lot of research which has been carried out, which points really towards 3 main issues that the sector faces. So one is around, in certain parts of the sector, related to conditions and quality. The other is around affordability, and the other is around sort of tenure security and people's ability to access the sector. So we asked landlords and tenants a separate set of questions that addresses but those 3 topics to try to get a kind of holistic view of what's happening. We also look at some questions around dispute resolution, which I'll come to talk about, because without kind of appropriate avenues for resolving disputes, we won't have better conditions in the sector. And we also talk about sort of, in each survey looks at a key topical issue. So the last one looked at the now dropped renters reform bill, but obviously some of the findings are transferable through to the new Renters' Rights Bill. So we look at these topics, how sort of people's experiences vary according to different sort of characteristics. So just on that, when we're looking at tenant profile, the research clearly shows that not all tenants are vulnerable, and the sector is not intrinsically harmful. But what we do know from our research is that the sector is housing a growing number of tenants who are more vulnerable to the harms associated with those three issues that I highlighted around affordability, poor property conditions, and tenure security. So, for example, there's now a significant number of tenants living in the sector who are on lower incomes, who are living with a long-term sort of health issue or disability. Our research also shows families living with children, in particular larger families, in particular single parent families, are more vulnerable to harms. Um, and we also know there's different sort of geographical regions face different challenges. So our research shows sort of urban areas and rural areas face different set of challenges as well. That diversity in sort of tenants' profiles and experiences is also reflected in terms of sort of the landlord population. So the landlord population is very diverse. People go into it for different reasons. They have different ways of managing their properties, different sort of responses to policy developments. But we do see some key trends. So most landlords are individuals. They have other employment other than renting out their property. Only about 15% sort of rent out property as a full or part-time business. Most have small portfolios, so almost half have just one property, and over 70% only have between 1 and 4 properties. There's a lot of landlords are sort of older as well, and there's about a third that are retired. Whilst about 20% of landlords get into renting properties for circumstantial reasons, so they inherit the property, for example, only about 5% say that they are in it for the short term. Most see it as a long-term investment towards their pension. And you'll see there's different sub-markets as well. So about just under 2/3 of landlords said they target working professionals, but there's about 6% that specifically target sort of tenants in receipt of housing benefit. There's about 7% that specifically target the student market. So lots of diversity there. And also what this slide shows is lots of diversity in landlords' financial circumstances and their financial resilience as well, which has some implications for the different sort of regulatory requirements that will be introduced going forwards. So in addition to sort of significant variation in markets and regions and characteristics, we also see lots of variation in property conditions and approaches to managing the property and the challenges that landlords might face in that regard. So this slide shows that there is a significant number of tenants who rate their property as good or acceptable, but there is a sizable minority who said the property is in poor or extremely poor condition, about 13%, and that's been consistent across the different waves of our survey. In relation to landlords' experiences here, there's about 40% that would say that when it comes to completing repairs and maintenance, they don't face any challenges, but there's many that say they do face challenges, particularly around sort of the cost of repairs and maintenance and accessing tradespersons. And we see throughout our research your different approaches to property inspections, etc., as well, which will make a big difference in terms of tenants' experiences of having these various issues addressed. So whilst there's variation with property conditions, we do see some very key sort of common threads and experiences when it comes to accessing the sector. So this is the majority of tenants report difficulties in trying to find a rental home, and this is becoming increasingly challenging. So in our last survey, 84% of tenants who had moved into a rental property said they experienced difficulties trying to find somewhere. And the most common difficulties were around trying to find an affordable property, and other kind of affordability related barriers also played a role. So in relation to deposit or being asked for rent in advance or securing a guarantor. Of course, your tenant's ability to access the sector is contingent on the supply which is available. There's a lot of surveys which ask landlords, what are their plans for their portfolio? Do they think they will sell or acquire more properties? And if so, why? That data is valuable. We also ask those questions, but it is limited because they don't give us a firm indication of, what exactly is happening. How firm are those plans? We don't know. Will they come to fruition? We don't know. So what we've done in our survey, we've asked sort of in the last year, what changes participating landlords made to their portfolios. And what we actually find is the majority made no changes. And slightly more landlords acquired properties than sold them. When we asked sort of the number of properties that were bought or sold, it was relatively equal. So what we conclude from this is that supply is actually remaining relatively static. And I think that reflects some of the larger national surveys which have been carried out as well. Now, I would say that is still problematic. We know there's, significant, we've got static supply in the face of rising demand. And we know from other data sources such as Zoopla and Rightmove, there are around 17 tenants or so chasing every property. So the other thing that our survey shows is that in particular submarkets, there might be more of an issue. So for example, landlords targeting the housing benefit market were more likely than other landlords to say that they've sold property in the last year and to say that they're planning on leaving the sector as well. So obviously that has implications for the ability of the tenants living on benefits, tenants living on the lowest income to secure rental homes. Obviously, the lack of supply has a knock-on impact for the affordability of rental properties. That's generally accepted now. And that's another really strong theme that comes out from our research. The significant number of tenants that are struggling to pay their rent every month. So it's and this is a problem that is intensifying. So in March of this year, 35% of tenants said they struggled to pay their rent last month. And this is much higher for, again, certain groups of tenants, such as students or people living with long-term health issues. And our survey shows, goes into some detail about the kind of impact that this is having on tenants. So we found, for example, 50% of tenants, over 50% of tenants, are cutting back on other household essentials, such as heating and food, in order to pay the rent. And with some groups of tenants, such as single parents, it's as high as 75% of that cohort of tenants cutting back on essentials to meet rental payments. So we wanted to our sort of landlords kind of side of the perspective on this, and we asked them, in the last 12 months, have you increased the rent, and if so, why, and if not, why not? 61% said they had increased the rent, and this was associated mainly with rising costs associated with maintenance, or with sort of rising sort of mortgage fees. And when we kind of broke this down into different landlord groups, unsurprisingly so, we found landlords that were on buy-to-let mortgages, which is about 47% of landlords, and particularly those on interest-only mortgages, about 17% of landlords were significantly more likely to increase the rent. So that no surprises there. A number of landlords said they didn't increase the rent, so 39% said they didn't, and this was motivated mainly out of concern for tenants, and concern about the cost of living for tenants, and a desire really to keep the tenants in situ as well. We know landlords have a preference for long-term tenancies, and when they have a good tenant, they're very keen to keep them. So within tenancies, some landlords will avoid raising the rent for that reason. And then there's a point on this slide as well about sort of the positive relationships that landlords and tenants both said that they shared with the other party. And we thought that was quite an interesting finding, and it kind of challenges some of the kind of dominant narrative that we hear out within the media and discussions about that relationship being necessarily confrontational or fractious. Actually, what we found in our research is that a large majority of tenants and landlords actually say they have a positive relationship with the other. And I found in this study and in other research projects I've worked on, that's actually quite an important factor when we look at how secure people feel in their property, in terms of tenants and how happy they are, but also in landlords, whether they raise the rent, whether they use a letting agent, and different decisions they make. Also, that relationship is really important. And this relationship also plays out when we look at sort of people, how different people approach, how landlords and tenants approach issues with the property. So tenants report, and again, this has been fairly consistent across waves, about 2/3 of tenants said they had a problem with the condition of their property in the last 6 months. Most commonly was around sort of damp and mold. But we go into those details in the survey. Repairs and maintenance is inevitable in any rental property, right? And we find that actually in the majority of cases, tenants do report those issues in the first instance to their landlord or letting agent. And in the majority of cases, tenants are saying these issues are fully or partially addressed. However, what our survey does find is that where a response is not forthcoming from the landlord or letting agent, tenants are very unlikely to escalate that complaint, right? To either go to one of the redress schemes or go to the local council. And we asked tenants the reasons why, why they didn't do that. And yes, fear of rent increases, fear of retaliatory eviction does play a role. But also what we found is tenants really don't know that they even have an option available, that these problems are legal problems and that there's redress available. And there's that real lack of awareness, which is a very significant problem across the sector. So this is kind of the last point I want to make, is that, we asked tenants if they had a problem with their rented home that the landlord wasn't addressing, would they know where to go? 50% said no. So 50% didn't even know they could go to the council, for example. Only 39% said they'd seen the How to Rent guide. So that's the main document the government relies on in order to educate tenants. All tenants are supposed to receive it at the start of their tenancy. We think many are, but very few recall receiving it. And very few tenants were aware of the previous renters sort of reform bill either. And just there's a statistic there on landlords' awareness as well. And so we think landlords' understanding and awareness of their legal responsibilities and rights is also quite limited. And that has real implications when we're thinking about compliance with the new sort of laws going forward. So just in terms of some final points from the data I presented today. So number one, there is significant diversity within the sector. It perhaps feels like an obvious point to make, but often the sector is talked about in very homogenized terms. It doesn't accurately reflect the diversity in markets and characteristics and experiences. And I think that has real implications when we're thinking about developing policies going forwards. For example, thinking about those landlords that might need more support with compliance, of thinking about those tenants that might be more vulnerable to harm. Secondly, difficulties finding a rental home and affordability, our surveys show, are the main issues that tenants are facing. So just following on from that, tackling the undersupply of housing will be, of course, key to improving the sector. And finally, the final point that I wanted to make is in relation to sort of tenants sort of the not escalating issues, not approaching the councils. And the removal of Section 21, of course, is the headline sort of policy reform on the government's agenda at the moment. This data suggests that removal of Section 21 alone won't be enough to improve conditions in the sector, because we are going to continue to rely on tenants raising complaints with their council. But if tenants don't know where to go or don't know that they have those rights in the first place, then barriers will remain. So thank you very much, everybody, for your participation. I'm just going to stop sharing that now. And I very much look forward to the responses from the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jennifer Harris. So next up, we'll have Darren Baxter from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to respond. And Samuel Hughes, I'll come to you afterwards. So thank you. Darren, do you want to share your views?
Sure. Thank you, Martina and Jonathan. Thanks for that presentation and the research. It's really interesting and fascinating. The kind of breadth of the data in there is great. I think one of the challenges we always face with the private rental sector, given its makeup of largely, as you say, largely sort of small scale amateur landlords, it can often be quite difficult to know what's actually going on in the private rental sector. And I think that leads sometimes to these kind of proclamations, like the sort of exodus of landlords and other kind of assumptions about what's going on. So I think these sorts of research projects that actually speak to landlords, speak to tenants, find out what's going on can be immensely helpful. In terms of responding to the content and what's in there, I think we've been working on private renting for a number of years. For those that don't know, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we're an organisation focused on poverty in the UK. We see housing as a major driver of poverty from the perspective of kind of housing costs pushing people into poverty, but also those on lower incomes having a kind of worse experience of the housing market, whether that's being more likely to live in poorer quality or more overcrowded or more insecure housing. And we've been campaigning for and arguing for renters' reform, renters' rights for a number of years now, and particularly since the Theresa May government in 2019 so first sort of consulted on reforming renting, and we've been arguing for that to push to the reforms to be introduced to be sort of ambitious and properly engage with solving the problem. And we were delighted to see the Renters' Rights Bill last week, I think, or the week before. And thought that the proposals in there with ending Section 21, bringing in a decent home standard, database and an ombudsman, longer protected periods from no-fault evictions are all really good. I think of course, in many of those areas, there are things we'd want to push further, but I think this is actually a sort of monumental sort of step change in reform. I think the things that sort of jump out from the research, though, that this sort of process of reform need to take account of, I think there were three things for me. So one is this point that you make, Jennifer, on kind of knowledge of reforms. So I was doing research in Scotland a few years ago, and just after Scotland embarked on similar reforms, and it was really striking when we ran focus groups with tenants and landlords, just how few people were aware of the fact that there'd been this sort of quite significant change in the legal rights afforded to tenants and the responsibilities on landlords. And for most landlords, they only really seemed to find out when a tenant moved and they relisted it with a letting agent, and the letting agent sort of said, actually, you now have all these new obligations on you, and it was a bit of a surprise for them to learn. And I think your research sort of demonstrates that is likely to be the same thing in England. And I think that gives politicians sort of and officials sort of two kind of routes to go down. So one is, I think you need to think, if you're going to rest on tenants sort of exercising their rights, and you need to combine this process with a kind of public information campaign and ways of giving tenants a much greater awareness of their rights. But I think there are other options as well. One of them is in the way in which some of the reforms are drafted. So, for example, there are going to be these sort of greater protections around decency, greater obligations on landlords to let homes at a decent standard, and ultimately, tenants will be sort of responsible for enforcing those rights. But equally, it could be this sort of obligation is on the landlord, given that there's going to be this new database where you have to register tenants, to basically sort of prove up front that homes are at that sort of decent standard before they're let, and place more of an onus on kind of registration regulation up front, rather than sort of encouraging tenants to exercise their rights in that way. And then the second thing that jumps out is that the biggest challenges in the private rental sector as ever are at that kind of bottom of the income distribution, at the bottom of the market. I think that what the research shows clearly, and analysis we've done has found similar, that where buy-to-let landlords are selling up, that has tended to be at that lower cost end of the market, and is creating a greater sort of supply crunch for poorer, lower income households. And we're also seeing that is where some of the sort of affordability pressure is greatest. Ultimately, one way of addressing that is through supply and the greater supply of social housing. But the new government faces a choice that their budget around the financial support it's paying to tenants, and there is a need for them to ensure that the sort of benefit support available to lower income renters in the form of local housing allowance keeps pace with the actual cost of rent. So that is due to be frozen in real terms. They should be kind of relinking that and making sure it keeps pace with inflation as we rental inflation as we go forward. And finally, I think your point that you sort of ended on, Jennifer, that these reforms can only go so far in protecting tenants, I think is right. I think we also need to grapple with the fact that the structure of the sector as largely sort of small scale kind of amateur investors is also part of the reason that we see some of the problems around security and poor quality. I think the findings that you have around, landlords sort of disinvesting and selling being a kind of major driver of no-fault evictions, that's not going to be stopped by ending Section 21. There are worries clearly that landlords have about forbearance and their ability to take risks with tenants, which is creating problems with access for people on lower income or people who have as of not British nationals. And the sort of difficulty in funding repairs, which is, again, I think a sort of business model issue, and whether or not your sort of rental yields enough to keep up with actually maintaining the cost of repairing and maintaining a house. And I think we need to be sort of, realistic about the capacity of regulation alone to fix those things. And then actually we need sort of more of a strategy for relying less on a kind of amateur private rented sector and more on other tenures. And I think that means partly it means building lots more homes, as the government keeps saying that they want to do, and probably going further than the ambition they have, to try and put downward pressure on prices, help people into home ownership who are kind of more affluent renters. It means building lots more social housing, again, as the government says they want to do, but it means them setting out an actual costed plan for doing that. And it also probably means encouraging a more institutional private rented sector. And we're seeing, I mean, we've just done and published some analysis that looks at what's happening to overall rental supply. And we find that some of a positive story, and that some of the sort of buy to let contraction is being offset by this more kind of build to rent, more institutional, more professional market. And I think I don't have the answers here, but I think looking at ways in which you can encourage more of that in cities and towns across the country would be, worth doing as a way of not just sort of addressing through regulation the kind of legal insecurity, but some of the more structural insecurity that is born from a more amateur private rented sector. But I think, a fantastic piece of research. It can be really, really useful. I can see us using it and referring to it lots. So interested in kind of questions from the audience.
Thank you, Darren. Samuel, what do you think?
Hello, so I'm going to just check that my mic is working. Loud and clear?
I can hear you.
Wonderful. Okay, it's new software, so I was a moment of risk right up to the last moment that you get with. So that was it's a really fascinating piece of research. I don't actually have a lot to add to it, but I'll just a few quick remarks. First point, which I think Darren really said the most important thing of all, which is that we have this conversation in the context of a very grave national housing shortage. Rent now takes up about 30% of household income for renters, up from about 10% in the 1980s. In London, the comparable figures are 40% versus 15%. There's a profound shift in the way that household budgets work and the pressure on household budgets. Many people are now involuntary renters. They would prefer to be homeowners, but they're stuck in the rental market because they can't afford a down payment. That means I think we've now got the fourth from lowest home ownership among European countries, which is a real reversal of historic norms where Britain tended to have more home ownership than most European countries. So that, again, a big source of discontent. And in the big background context, housing has not been this expensive relative to average earnings since the 1870s. So really like a very bad and worsening situation. That clearly does mean that, especially at the lower end of the private rental sector, there's a lot of conditions which I think we would all agree here are very shocking and very grave. And this is and could be the really fundamental way to deal with that is expanding the housing stock, improving the quality of the housing stock. These points that Darren raises, and it's really encouraging to see the government talking about this, encouraging to see the way this has come up the political agenda in Britain in recent years, encouraging to see something like a cross-party consensus emerging on it. But we have seen lots of attempts to reform housing supply in this country before over the decades, and they've tended to hit political reefs. So we've really got to be focused on trying to help the government to deliver that. And that lots of these problems that we face in the private rental sector are downstream of that more fundamental problem that we have with housing supply. So second big background point, renting can be a good thing. It can be a good thing in our housing market. It can be a good thing even in an ideal housing market. So most British people would ideally like to be owners ultimately in their lives, but for many of them, renting is the best option at the moment because they can't afford a down payment. For other people, renting is just the best option because they move regularly and don't want the frictional costs of home purchase. That's especially an issue in Britain at the moment because of stamp duty, which makes moving homes so expensive. But it's inevitably true to some extent because if you're a homeowner, moving home is just much more complicated than if you're a renter. So even in the ideal housing market, we've still got a substantial private rental sector, and so we shouldn't think of private renting as a problem. Private rent, certainly not necessarily a problem. It's an essential part of a flourishing housing market, which has some problems at the moment. The other thing we should remember is, because moving homes when you're a homeowner is so much more difficult, people do it much less. That disincentivizes downsizing. That tends to lead to a more inefficient allocation of the housing stock. So the familiar complaint that lots of people are still in big family-sized homes, which don't have much value to them anymore, because they would be heavily penalized if they moved, if they downsized. That clearly, in a country with a housing shortage, that's quite a mad situation, and that is making the housing shortage worse. Renting does tend to lead, because it doesn't have such high frictional costs, it does tend to lead to people moving faster, it does tend to facilitate downsizing, and so it probably leads to a more efficient allocation of housing stock. So in a housing stock which is so supply constrained as ours, that's an additional advantage that renting has. And if renting becomes less popular relative to home ownership, we'll probably also end up with a more inefficient allocation of the housing stock, and then we'll probably end up with a worse housing shortage. So that's a reason why in our problematic housing sector, renting has special reasons for us to think it's an important component. Renters reform is interesting, obviously well motivated, will have some benefits, but it does pose risks, and those have obviously been brought out by the TDS report, although I think how grave those risks will be is still very unclear. So, of course, security tenure is valuable. Darren alluded to some of the reasons why that's the case. The potential issue with prohibiting fixed tenancies, ending Section 21, is that it makes it harder for landlords to evict poorly behaved tenants. Certainly impossible for them to do so without legal action, and many landlords, especially small landlords, would really prefer not to go to court because it's stressful and difficult. It's also easier to evict in order to re-inhabit a property. It could make it much more difficult to evict in order to re-inhabit a property, again, without legal action, which people want to avoid. So I think even if the system envisioned under the Renters' Rights Bill works well, it's still likely to make it less attractive to be a landlord. The situation is, and that in turn will lead to some landlords leaving the sector, either selling the properties into own occupation or leaving them empty, or just re-inhabiting them. And that, for reasons that we've already alluded to, will generate a worse situation in some respects for tenants, with depleted available stock, potentially higher rents, potentially more screening of aspirant renters. Now, we don't know how grave these problems are going to be yet. I think the TDS report is very valuable in suggesting that we're not seeing a mass exodus from the sector yet, but we might be seeing substantial movement out of some parts of the sector, maybe particularly vital parts for low-income households. But the big thing that it also highlights is that awareness of lots of this is often still quite low. Big landlords will be much more across the detail on regulatory change, incoming regulatory change. Small landlords may really not be aware of it. So we're going to be running a kind of microeconomic experiment in real time and finding out how much this leads to exit from the sector in the months ahead. But it's definitely something we should be very concerned about. The other point we should raise is, at the moment, the system is not working as the drafters of the Renters' Rights Bill envision, because we have this bottlenecking of the tribunal system. The court system is currently not in a good place, even to process the number of complaints we're getting at the moment, let alone to process a much larger number of complaints if landlords start relying upon the tribunal system in order to evict tenants to re-inhabit, or in order to evict a much larger number, to evict poorly behaved tenants, rather than just using Section 21. So that could make things considerably more problematic. If you were a homeowner and you were moving abroad for a year and you wanted to let out your property for a year and then re-inhabit when you came back, if you thought, when I come back, potentially I might have to take my tenants to court in order to re-inhabit, and there are many, many, many months of delays for getting a court appointment, you might well think probably best not to let out this property at all. Just leave it empty for the year that I'm abroad, and then I won't have to have the stress of delayed legal action when I return. So I think the best case Renters' Rights Bill outcome, where we have a really high functioning tribunal system and the courts process cases rapidly, that may not, that system still has some risks and will probably still lead, at least to some extent, to landlords leaving the sector, but the risks won't be that great and the exodus may be quite slight. But if we don't fix the court system, then it could be much more grave, and the acceleration of the Renters' Rights Bill, as the current government envisions it, as opposed to the last government, makes those risks greater than they were previously. So I think that's, in a way, the number one priority for those of us who are interested in the private rental sector, is trying to work out a plan for the tribunal system to make sure that it that it functions more smoothly than it does at the moment, rather than less smoothly after renters reform comes through, so as to mitigate some of the downside risks that renters reform brings with it. I think that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samuel. So we are now going to take questions. So there's a, please ask your questions in the question box on the side. So first of all, I want to just ask, so one of the big things that were highlighted in your research, Jennifer, is the diversity of the sector, and specifically the increase in more vulnerable tenants, people with children, people on the in receipt of housing benefits. However, Section 21, when I speak to, letting agents who deal with this on a daily basis, the problem is that anybody who's got a risk profile, who is on housing benefit, for example, or might not have a long credit record, or is just something unusual about them. If a landlord can't get them out of their property, they will be less likely to rent to them. So it means that these people who are most vulnerable are less likely to be accepted in homes. And there is a shortage of rental stock, especially on the lower end of the market. So you have this squeeze. So what I want to ask this to all three of you, how do you see that working out? Jennifer, maybe you can go first.
So so I think sort of it touches on a point that Samuel raised as well about a well-functioning sort of tribunal and court system, because I think you need to ensure that landlords do have confidence to that if necessary, that they can gain possession of their property. There might be a risk, again, we don't know for sure to the extent to which it's going to play out, that otherwise, as Samuel said, they might introduce more stringent tenant selection criteria, which could negatively impact those who, like you said, might not have the perfect sort of tenant profile, so to speak. But also, I do think, in terms of we need to look at the addressing the disincentives that might exist as well, that in relation to housing people that are in receipt of benefit, for example. So, in the Renters' Rights Bill, there's a proposal to sort of limit sort of blanket bans on tenants that are in receipt of benefits. So that's very much the stick approach. But then I'm wondering, where's the carrot? So what reforms that could possibly be introduced into the how universal credit sort of is allocated and operated to reduce some of those disincentives to housing that group? So, for example, delays, rent paid in arrears, the fact that it's paid directly to the tenant rather than the landlord. So that's one of the things I think we need to look at as well.
Darren, what do you think? Is Section 21 going to punish the most vulnerable tenants and make it very hard for them to get a home?
No, I don't think it's going to punish them, and I don't think the benefits from it sort of far away some of these issues. I think there is a risk of landlords taking a view that this increases risk or whatever. I think some mitigations for that are that have already been mentioned are worth exploring. But I think it's worth saying that a lot of these things happen already in the system. The reason that the legislation is talking about kind of moving away from blanket bans on people who are in receipt of benefits, on people with children, is because these are sorts of things that kind of are widespread in the sector anyway. Lots of letting agents are advising landlords to do it. Lots of landlords are doing it off their own back. And in the case of banning discriminations against people claiming benefits, I mean, it's been proven to be illegal to do that anyway. And so really the legislation is more just sort of clarifying a point of law rather than sort of bringing in something new. I think there is a sort of valid point there around the kind of benefit system, which is why has it become so, why is it not just income that causes concern or a view that there's an increased risk, but like the actual functioning of the social security system? And partly that has been about this of the fact that local housing allowance has lagged behind in terms of adequacy for 6 of the last 10 years, and there have at times been really big gaps between where rents are and the generosity of that system or the adequacy of that system, and also because of the delays that sort of Jennifer mentions. And those are very much in the gift of government to resolve, both on the adequacy point and the functioning of the system. I think they would be sensible things to do, which would give greater confidence to people letting to those on lower incomes.
Samuel, do you have any thoughts?
I don't have a lot to add. I think it's very well. It's a very good question. Like, it's fairly obvious, in my view, that if you raise the risks of having a bad tenant, then people will take stronger measures to avoid having a bad tenant with more extensive screening. Or if they can't avoid having bad tenants, then they have a stronger incentive to leave the market. It's almost impossible that those factors are not true to some extent. The question that we don't fully know yet is how true they're going to be. And we're going to find out, because there's this bill is going to pass, and then we're going to see how strong the incentives are for landlords to screen more, and for them to leave the sector. So it's but I mean, there will be some negative impacts on tenants. And those negative impacts will be concentrated at the lower end of the market. Whether how strong they are, that remains to be seen. But I do think the governments of this country have a fairly unedifying record of generating a small and poor quality housing stock and then trying to legislate better housing conditions into being. In the end, it is quite hard to legislate better housing conditions into being when the housing that is available is just so poor. So that it will ultimately have to come back to this question of housing supply, which, to its credit, the government does seem to be trying to do. So that's the. But I do think, of course, there are risks here, and they could turn out to be quite unpleasant.
Jenny Lamb asked a question. Do we know where letting agent advice and fees feature in rent increases? So do landlords class the increased fees as running costs, or is that a reason for raising rent? Jennifer, did you see any evidence of letting agent fees raising rents?
So it wasn't specifically fees, but when we asked landlords why they increased the rent, advice from letting agent came up as 16%. So it was like the 5th or 6th most commonly cited reason. Increased sort of costs, fees and maintenance was sort of a catch-all kind of category. That was the number one reason for raising rents, and assumedly letting agent fees might fall within that. I do think it raises sort of an important point in relation to the role of letting agents in sort of alleviating or exacerbating some of these problems. And it's a research question, one that has not yet been fully addressed. So I think, that's an important issue.
Another question, how do we get information about the change in security of tenure through to tenants? And related to that, how do we encourage tenants to complain about issues in the property as they cannot face a Section 21 anymore, or they won't be able to? Jennifer, that's, I don't know, maybe Darren, you want to respond to that one? How do we get the information to tenants?
So I won't. I'm not 100% sure on how you get the information to tenants, but I think we have, run various different sort of campaigns to inform people about sort of big changes to policy or regulation or whatever else. And I'm sure there are ways. There must be comms people in government who have thoughts on this if they're sort of deployed against that tax. But on this point of how do you get tenants to enforce their rights? I think. There are two ways. One, which is being done by the proposed new legislation, which is increasing where rent repayment orders can be used, because I think we have seen that where tenants can sort of challenge their landlords and get kind of a financial sort of payout where they've been sort of done wrong to, that has sort of focused minds and has created kind of advice. There've been ways in which that has sort of targeted advice to tenants, where, for example, like deposits have not been lodged properly, and people realise that there is basically then an incentive to enforce your rights. So I think it's welcome to see that. The other is, I think there is an opportunity around the sort of registration of new tenancies to do some sort of upfront work to make sure properties are at the sort of standard that they should be. So I think sort of Julie Rugg at the University of York proposed this idea of a sort of property MOT, so landlords proving that their homes meet the sort of standards that are set out in legislation before they're lodged onto these sort of portals, so that then you basically put the onus on the landlord to sort of prove it up front, rather than sort of hoping that already stretched local authorities might go around and do some proactive inspection, or tenants might kind of know their rights and go via these various different routes to sort of enforce them among their landlords. I think basically the more simple route is sort of prove it at the outset.
Can I just come in on that question as well, please? Because it's something I've been thinking about a little bit recently when we talk about sort of ensuring tenants are aware of and able to enforce their rights. So I have sort of 3 points to make. One is in relation to the kind of findings that I shared about the kind of diversity in sort of tenant and landlord characteristics. So how do we need to kind of provide information in a diversity of channels and in a diversity of ways to meet the different sort of needs and characteristics that are out there. So now we just depend on this sort of how to rent guide, which is 20 pages long, very text heavy, comes at the bottom of a big pack of papers that tenant gets when they start their tenancy and they're moving in and they're all stressed. I think we need to just think a little bit more, just think a little bit more about how we're providing information. So that's one. The second is thinking about, when do people need information? So we know there's a lot of kind of large scale legal needs survey research, which shows that people look for information in times of crisis, right? So ideally, yes, we all want all tenants to go away and read this document and educate themselves about, what their rights are and what to do if there's a problem. In reality, that's probably not going to happen. Lots of us don't read kind of the instruction manual until something goes wrong, right? Same for tenants. So we need to think about, well, what does research tell us where tenants go when they have a housing problem? And we know from existing research, this is to not your usual suspects, law centres, citizens advice, it's community centres, it's libraries, it's GPs. So when we're talking about a public awareness raising campaign, we need to think about how do we get that information into places where tenants are going to go when they have a housing problem. And then my third and final point is in relation to the redress landscape, right? It's super complex depending on what your problem is and depending on how you rent, whether it's through a letting agent or via landlord, etc. There's numerous places you can go. There's lots of different ombudsmen, there's the courts, there's the tribunal, there's councils. They all have different jurisdictions. They all have different ways of operating. And then if we have this new landlord ombudsman, which has been proposed in the Renters' Rights Bill, this is potentially only adding to existing complexity. Lots of different organizations have suggested that what we need is a single point of access that people can go when they have a problem with their tenancy, and it directs them, to the appropriate redress scheme. So the TDS Charitable Foundation is introducing kind of a form of that. We're introducing sort of a diagnostic tool, a signposting service called the My Housing Issue Gateway. So I'd be very happy to talk to people about that, offline. But it will be launched later this year, and that is an interactive online platform to try to help tenants figure out where to go and what to do when they have a problem, including when they've been issued sort of an eviction notice. So.
Yes. I mean, related to that, Sean Hooker from the Property Redress Scheme is asking, is there a way to overcome data protection to use the data kept by deposit protection schemes to contact tenants and tell them about their rights?
So for those that don't know, the TDS is sort of the UK's leading deposit protection agency, and I think with the new the three main schemes, we all operate under government tender, government contract. That's going to be going out to tender. We expect over sort of the next 6 months, 6 to 12 months, and I think what you'll see within that is an increasing emphasis from government in how we can use these schemes and how we can use these existing channels in order to better educate and inform both tenants and landlords. And again, that's when I'm thinking about how do we think more expansively about educating tenants. It's the format it's provided in, but it's also how do we use those existing channels such as deposit protection schemes. So I think actually we'll see more activity on that front going forwards.
There was a question on how many landlords have mortgages and how many don't in terms of the percentages. Can you just remind the audience of that, Jennifer, and what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just trying to remember it off the top of my head. So I think it was about 45% had buy-to-let mortgage, 17% of which was interest-only mortgages, and I think there was just shy of 50% sort of funded their properties without any debts or borrowing. So what this suggests is there's huge diversity in landlords' financial circumstances, their financial resilience when it comes to things like rising interest rates, rising costs, but also the cost implications with some of the new government proposals. For example, new minimum energy efficiency requirements, decent home standards, etc. Some of these will have cost implications. Some landlords will be better able to meet those requirements than others. Again, geographical area is important here. There's certain areas of the countries where property values are a lot lower, so there's implications there as well. So and we also found, as I discussed earlier, that those factors had a role to play in relation to whether or not landlords raised the rent, unsurprisingly. So yeah.
Samuel, one for you. The problem of a lack of affordable supply won't be solved overnight. How can this government make the PRS more affordable in the short to medium term? Any ideas?
I don't think there is a short-term solution to the unaffordability of the private rental sector. It's if government has mismanaged housing supply for decade after decade and left us in a grave affordability crisis, and getting out of that situation will take a great deal of building, and that will take a while. So they're clearly, there's currently a situation with housing benefit and universal credit, which is leaving some British people in a totally unacceptable situation, rising homelessness because of the inability of either local government or Treasury or inability or unwillingness to provide people with enough income to get decent homes. That's something where clearly it's expensive, but there is something that the state can do about that. But high housing costs are more or less a corollary of extremely scarce supply, and addressing scarce supply. I mean, we could and need to do it much faster than we're doing, but it will take a while. Sorry, that's a depressing answer.
So, Darren, one for you. The government seems to have removed the implementation delay, which was in the previous Renters Reform Bill. What impact do you think that having no delayed implementation will have, and should there be one?
I might be cheeky and go back on that rents question as well, which is but just on this sort of implementation one. Well, I don't think they're saying that there won't be any implementation debate. I think there will sort of inevitably have to be a point where this sort of comes in, and that this affects. It's clearly not going to happen overnight. There's going to be a point where government says, from X date, this new reform will take place. I think there is a question of whether that, you know, as happened in Scotland, you have a kind of phasing between applying to sort of immediately to new tenancies and then there being a sort of timing out. I think that's the bit that they've sort of moved on. I think the problem with the previous sort of reforms, the sort of renters reform bill that, you know, prior to the election was not that there was an implementation phase. It's just that implementation phase was completely open-ended and subject to sort of resolving these court delays, which there was no sort of real specificity around what that meant or what, like, a, you know, resolving those problems would look like. So I think, you know, inevitably there will be some sort of implementation phase, but it's right that we move quickly to end Section 21. And I think, you know, I wouldn't sort of disagree with Samuel that there's a lot of work to be done to reduce housing costs, that rents to income ratios, house price to income ratios over time. And there is more that government could be doing than it is doing and it's proposing to do. And there are things like a sort of a planning and infrastructure bill that's going to be coming apparently, and, you know, I'm sure we'll both be looking at that with interest. But I think over the last how many decades, even when house prices relative to earnings were much more aligned, we've always sort of subsidised housing costs, whether that's through cash transfers, whether it's through social housing, whether it's through rent control, and each of those have strengths, weaknesses, consequences. But, you know, government's always had to sort of acknowledge that, you know, for those at the lower end of the income distribution, that there is some sort of you know, intervention that's needed. And I think the problem is at the moment we have sort of the worst of both worlds, where we have these sort of big structural problems in the housing market that leads to worsening affordability, and then also a sort of which we're not doing enough to resolve. And then also we're not doing enough to sort of mop up the consequences of high costs and recognising that we need like a sustainable plan for sort of subsidising those housing costs for those on the lowest incomes. So I think there is definitely more at both ends government can be doing. And some of those things will, you know, like, for example, reforms to local housing allowance, building more social housing might yield results quickly.
We need to wrap up soon, so I'm just going to combine some questions. So there's a question here on, does the study ask tenants who their landlord is, i.e. do they rent from an independent landlord or a build-to-rent landlord? Are there differences in experience? Jennifer, so if you can respond on that, and then Darren, if you can respond on what should be the division between corporate and social landlords versus private landlords who are individuals, and how does this compare to Europe?
So our survey does ask tenants whether they rent directly from the landlord or directly via a letting agent, but we don't look at sort of individual landlords versus those that are more institutional. I think that is a research gap going forward that does need to be addressed, particularly for those more lower income renters. We assume that people get a better standard of service if they're renting through an institutional landlord rather than through a smaller, more quote-unquote amateur landlord. But I would welcome research that explores that. Yeah.
Darren, what does the data say on the division, and what should it be?
So looking in other countries, there's a mix of obviously different places, but I think lots of countries across Europe have more pluralistic rental markets where you have different models, a mix of individuals, institutional landlords, more things that are more we would consider to be like sort of more cooperative non-profit sort of entities. And I think that is where I don't have a view on the precise division proportionately between these two different types in the housing market in England or in the UK. But I think we're already starting to see some of a shift as some landlords who've been exposed to higher interest rates are selling up, some who are sort of were part of that big buy-to-let boom and are simply just retiring are sort of selling up. And we're seeing, in particularly in big cities, some of that stock being kind of replaced by these more institutional landlords. And I think we should sort of acknowledge that as being, you know, positive and some maturation. I think thinking about the role that government can play in supporting different models of different types that provide kind of rental housing, which speaks to, I think, the point you started on, Samuel, which is that, you know, lots of people want, there is a need for a rented sector, and you know, the proportion of people renting hasn't actually changed as dramatically as we sometimes think it has over the last how many decades. It's what has changed is who they rent from, and now a majority rent from private landlords, and a minority from social landlords. And I think thinking, as important as regulation is, thinking also about the sort of how those homes are provided is important. And it also gets us to a point of that's another way of sort of boosting supply generally, if you think about different forms of new housing provision.
On that note, we need to, we're out of time. So, one thing that's come through very clearly is, given the diversity of both in tenants and landlords and the undersupply of housing, just scrapping Section 21 is not going to, on its own, drive up standards or increase affordability. So a lot more needs to be done on relationships between landlords and tenants and communicating rights and so on. So thank you very much for your time, to our speakers, and to all of you for listening. Thank you very much.